It's an amazing organization. Tonight, we're all here to hear from Divya and Anantharaman about her work as a taxidermist. And when I got to reading about her, I just felt like, wow, she just does amazing things. She's a premier taxidermist in New York City. She does work for museums, collectors, conservation organizations like the Harris Center, and private clients. And I hope, Divya, that you're going to talk a little bit about how you yourself became a taxidermist, because I think it's a really interesting story. So I'm not going to keep talking. I'm going to let you take it away. And thanks so much for saying yes to this opportunity. We're all so excited to have you here. So we give you a round of applause. Yeah.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. I mean, I can't wait to, when it's all safe again to travel, I can't wait to visit the Harris Center. So it sounds really wonderful.
Yeah, we'd love to have you. And I do.
No worries at all. So hi everybody, my name is Divya. I run Gotham Taxidermy. I'll talk a little bit about how I got into taxidermy. Basically, I did not go to school for the sciences. I went to school for the arts. But as I was growing up, my mom was a biology teacher, and she always had educational aids. She always had like little study skins, framed insects, specimens in jars, and things like that. And that really fascinated me. I thought, wow, these things are so cool. What a way to get up and close to nature. And especially since I grew up in a city. I grew up in Miami, and right now I live in New York City. I've always lived in urban centers. And so even though there are lots of birds and bird watching and things like that in our parks, especially, and New York is on a migratory, it's on a migratory flyway, taxidermy was how I really got close to animals. And I kind of saw them as these little works of art. And I was always just really curious about it. And I, collected books about it. I, read every book I could about it. Still am working on it. There's so many books about taxidermy, and, watched videos and ended up collecting roadkill on my own when it was, wherever it was legal to do so. And, tried taxidermy on my own, being self-taught. And all this time I was also working in the fashion industry. And taxidermy was sort of my hobby until like 8 years ago. It stopped being my hobby. I started getting a little more serious about it by attending state shows and competitions and, learning from other taxidermists there and kind of developing the confidence to make it my career. And I've been in business full time for about 5 or 6 years. So that's a little bit of how I got into taxidermy. But tonight I'm going to talk to you a bit about the history of taxidermy, about how it's an art form that's been used to communicate science and the importance of it for conservation. I'm going to cover a bit of history. I'm going to go on a short tour of my studio and show you some projects that I've worked on. And after this talk, I hope that you'll look at taxidermy with, I guess, a invigorated or renewed reverence, and get inspired to maybe try it on your own, to even look at it differently, or read more about it, because I feel like there's a lot of unexplored potential with taxidermy, and it's so exciting to see more and more people get into it and get interested in it. And with a place like the Harris Center, which uses it for conservation, taxidermy and naturalists, they go hand in hand, and they have throughout time. And what's so exciting about now is that access to all of these things is increasing. So we can have more, we have more people interested in taxidermy, and we can have a more diverse crowd that's interested in it, which just creates so many exciting opportunities. So I've got some slides to share with you. So what is taxidermy? So this piece here is, or the slide I have up here, is a piece, but it's an illustration from a book by Leon Prey, which shows a squirrel. It shows the assembly of a squirrel. So you've got its skin on the outside, which I think you can see my cursor. So you've got the skin on the outside here. And inside, this is a form that's made of wire and wood wool. And wood wool basically looks like straw. So the roots of the word taxidermy come from taxi, which is to move or arrange, and derma, which is skin. So as a concept, taxidermy it's pretty simple. It's mounting that clean and preserved skin onto an anatomically accurate form. But as we all know, taxidermy can vary widely and wildly. Each mount can be very different. It can be very different in quality. It can be very different in technique. And these are mounts from 3 very different times, with 3 very different end effects here. We have the Lion of Gripsome Castle, a Barbary lion, and a more modern lion piece, which is just one I found as a royalty-free image on the internet. But generally,
sorry to interrupt. If you could move that screen over a little bit, we can't see that first lion.
Oh, sure.
Oh, there we go. Perfect.
Oh, awesome.
Thanks.
No problem. Is everything visible now? Okay. So the execution varies really widely, but generally the only thing that's true to taxidermy, and that's true in all these pieces of taxidermy, is that you've got the skin, that's the only thing original to the animal, and then all the other parts are fabricated. The eyes, the soft tissue detail, sometimes even the teeth and tongue are replicated. And even like on birds, sometimes we even use replica heads, replica feet. And so all those things are fabricated, and they can be painted or pigmented to look like they're alive, to give that illusion of life. And to make an animal look alive, again, it requires this understanding of anatomy, but it also requires this understanding of, how the animal moves, where it lives, how it changes through the seasons. And a lot of that information is gained right now from like the internet, from books, from videos. But the most valuable form of gaining that information is actual observation of animals, like out in the field, and being able to observe them in real life as they're alive. There's also like you can gain a lot of information from the deceased animal, but when it's alive, it has a lot more accuracy. And so we'll get a little into the history of taxidermy. So it was a way of sharing information, especially in the age before the internet, where we can just send images so quickly, anywhere we want to anyone we want to. Taxidermy was how people would communicate about animals and share their knowledge of animals. There were all of these expeditions, especially in this colonial era, where these cabinets of curiosities were built, which eventually turned into museums and research collections. And though there are definitely some unsavory elements to a lot of these expeditions, they did shape how people learned about the wonders of the natural world. And it's hard to pin down what the very first piece of taxidermy was, since all of the practices are so wide and so varied. But preserving animals it's been around for as long as people have been around. I think the first documented practices of preserving animals come from mummification from South America and Egypt. But the oldest surviving piece of what we would consider taxidermy is a crocodile that dates to the 1530s, which is hanging in the ceiling. It came from the ceiling of a church in Italy. It was a gift. And since I love birds, the oldest piece of bird taxidermy that we know of is the Duchess of Richmond's pet parrot, which dates to the early 1700s. And the 1800s were sort of a golden age of taxidermy because techniques, materials, and details, those all advanced. And there are tons of taxidermists from this sort of era you can read about. Carl Akeley is one, we were discussing him earlier. Leon Prey is another one. I love his books and his illustrations, and he even made sort of taxidermy zines with these like sort of cheeky sayings and illustrations in them. They're really humorous and cool. And there were the Jonas Brothers. I mean, there are so many taxidermists from that time, but I'm going to share some more overlooked taxidermists who happen to be some of my favorites because their stories aren't as celebrated as the other ones. So the first one I'm going to share is John Edmonstone. John Edmonstone lived in Guyana. He was an enslaved person there, but he learned taxidermy from Charles Waterton. And after his freedom, he moved to Edinburgh, and he went on to make mounts for the Natural History Museum there. And he taught taxidermy and specimen prep to Charles Darwin. And we all know what Charles Darwin did. And that was a really vital skill, Darwin learning taxidermy and specimen preservation, because if he did not learn that, there's no way he could have brought all those finches back from from his expeditions to the Galapagos. And when Darwin said that in some of these accounts, that when Darwin was learning taxidermy, he actually took the classes on a whim from Edmonstone. He was originally enrolled in school for medicine, but decided to take some taxidermy classes just for fun. And when he learned taxidermy from Edmonstone, of course, he loved taxidermy, and he was also hearing the stories about he's hearing the stories about his time in nature and his time back in South America and stuff. So it really ignited his curiosity about that too. A lot of people say that it ignited that curiosity. So, Edmonstone, one way or other, had a really huge impact on history, and I wish he was as well known as Darwin was. And I think his story is just so remarkable and so incredible. Another great historic taxidermist I love is Martha Maxwell. There's two really great books about her. But what I love about Martha Maxwell is she was just like completely unapologetic and lived her life like very, very like just to the max. Like she did what she wanted and she didn't stop until she got what she wanted. She was an American taxidermist in the mid 1800s. She had a pretty eccentric personality, but she was extremely talented. Her work was so realistic. She broke a lot of barriers for women at the time and had this exhibit at the Philadelphia Centennial, which was this taxidermy installation. It was pretty epic. They were, not only did she have these incredible dioramas of the wildlife of Colorado, but she even had live prairie dogs running around in there, and like working water features and all of these, just like, and at the time, if you think of something like that, it was just like beyond even Disney World for them. It was really unbelievable. And, you've got all the wildlife from Colorado in a place like Philadelphia where everyone is seeing it. So it was extremely powerful. And I think the most powerful part of her whole exhibit was that she titled it Women's Work. And that was in response to a lot of the attitudes of the day, a lot of the sort of misogynist and not so savory attitudes of the day, because people didn't believe that she made this work, or they were like, how does a woman even do it? Those were questions that she was asked, and she called the exhibit that. And she was actually one of the very few women who was given the opportunity to speak in public at the time, because it wasn't normal back then. So that's just how good she was, and how strong she was to go for that. And on top of all of that, she even has an owl named after her that she observed and sent to the Smithsonian. The third taxidermist I'll go into from history is Carl Cotton, and there's actually a really great exhibit about him at the Field Museum in Chicago. He is the Field Museum's first Black taxidermist. He worked there from the 40s through the 70s. The story about how his exhibit came about is pretty cool too. I believe it was Tori Lee, an exhibits developer there, who came across a photo of him in the museum archives, and then was like, who is this guy that is creating, who's preparing these incredible dioramas? And she ended up contacting the family and making all these connections, and learning that so many of the specimens that are in the field were mounted by him. And one of the really cool things about Carl Cotton, aside from, I'm a bird nerd and all these birds here are so cool, and that shoebill like back there, I was like, that's so cool, he got to work on that. But on top of that, one of the really cool things is that he really worked on this technique using cellulose acetate to replicate animal skin. So especially with hairless animals, anything that doesn't have hair on it, like reptiles and amphibians, but also animals that are very sparsely haired. That was a technique to kind of make their skin look better than it did in life. That's a really cool technique that he developed. So that's a bit about some historic taxidermists that I love. So I'm going to talk to you now about how taxidermy is made. We'll go on a short tour of my studio, and I'll give you an idea of the process. And I'll also have some photos of skinned animals here. So if anyone's like eating dinner, or if someone is sensitive to it, or if, I don't know, if you don't want to see deceased animals in various states of preparation, maybe close your eyes now until the next like 5 or 6 slides. So the first step with taxidermy is to get your reference, and of course get your specimens. So specimens I get from all over the place. It really depends on the client. If it's like a museum client, they're providing the specimen to me. If it's a private client, like I actually work with breeders and aviaries. Sometimes I buy specimens from farms or food suppliers. There are so many different sources for specimens that are firstly, you have to check if they're legal, and then the next thing to check is if they fall into your line of ethics and sustainability. But once you have your specimen, it's time to gather reference. So this is a measurement chart that I use. I didn't invent this measurement chart. It's one that if you want the link to it, you can download it online. It's from a taxidermist in the UK. This is a bird measurement chart. And you can see there are lots of pretty detailed measurements here, from the head to the body, from the front and the back and the sides, from all of these different views, even the length of the tail. So there are all of these measurements here that I take. And in addition to that, I'll also get books on the subject, depending on what the subject is. If it's a bird, if it's a mammal, what type of bird and what type of mammal. Then there's, of course, doing live observation of them too. So once you've gotten your reference and once you've got your specimen, the next step would be to skin the specimen. And this is a hummingbird, and this was done for a nature center. So I can go into the laws after this, but basically all native birds in the US are protected. So please don't pick up hummingbirds and native birds unless they're going to a nature center. The next step is skinning and cleaning. Once you have your reference and stuff gathered. Here you can see that I've made an incision. It's the same hummingbird. I made an incision here just to start removing the skin. And you can see that skin is pretty thin. It's not really very thick, but still it comes off. And you can see here that the skin, once it's taken off of the body, it's pretty lifeless and it has no shape, and it really has no memory to it once it's removed from the body. It's pretty sad. And you can see that it's also wet, so it doesn't look anything like a hummingbird. And here is the skinning and processing area that's in my studio. I live in New York City, so my studio is really tiny. It's also in my home, so it's nothing really. So I've really learned to work in a really small space. So my skinning area is nothing but a countertop that is just devoted to skinning. That sink there is devoted to my taxidermy stuff, and everything there is really easy to sterilize. So I can bleach it, I can use alcohol on it. There are no bumpy surfaces. Like everything is easy to clean and kind of slick and smooth. And then I keep all my tools on this magnetic rack that just makes them easy to access. So there's that. And then these cabinets up here, I keep all of the chemicals I use. And a lot of people think of formaldehyde and arsenic when it comes to taxidermy, but modern chemicals are much safer now. So there's no formaldehyde and arsenic that I'm using in my home. So there's that. And then here are some more shots of cleaning the skin. So once you take the skin off the animal, there's layers of fat underneath. So I didn't show this on the hummingbird because the hummingbird is really, really tiny and I don't have that macro of a lens. But this is I believe this is a woodcock that I skinned, and they have really, really, not a woodcock, a red knot, red knot that I skinned, which has really, really, really heavy fat underneath the skin. So you can see that layer of fat, and you can see how thin the skin is. So all that fat has to come out. And this is a crane that shows the cleaned skin. So this skin has been washed and cleaned. You can see the bones in here have been cleaned. But you can see the difference between a sort of freshly fatty skin and all of the fat and viscera removed. And then comes the form and fitting. So once you have that skin clean and you've applied a preservative to it, then you make a form. So here I'm showing you the form. I'll show you a form for a large bird for this crane. So here I made a form out of wood wool and used the cast head so you can see the form, which I did alter quite a bit after this, but then you can see it with the skin on it. And then you can see the same form for the hummingbird from before. So this is a really tiny form. It's the complete opposite of the crane. It's really, really small, it's the size of a penny. A little bit smaller than a penny. And this form is made with balsa wood, and I made a wire neck with some cotton around it. And this is where I make all my forms. It's sort of a little sculpting bench there. So all my tools are around me. And again, it's probably like an 8 foot wide bench. So nothing too huge, just a little place. And the next thing after you've mounted a piece is the finishing work. So the finishing work is it's one of my favorite parts. It's kind of where all of the magic happens, because on this bird here, on this toucan, I use a sculpted beak or a cast beak because the skull is really cool and I wanted to keep the skull. So this is the cast beak here. And of course, this doesn't look like a toucan, doesn't have all the colors. And this is me applying the color to it and grooming it a little bit. You can see that not only is there color in the beak, but there's also color in the face and that tissue there. That tissue was blended. You can see it's sort of more blended into the feather line. And so that looks more, it looks more realistic. And I think that's one of the really magical places in taxidermy where you can, it kind of makes or breaks, can kind of make or break a mount. And the next thing I'll show you is a finished piece. So this is that finished hummingbird. I know it's a male in a nest, which is not correct, but that's what the Nature Center wanted for telling the story. And there's a video of it that I hope you can all see. You can see how much it shines, so I'll play it again in case it didn't show. But that's sort of the process, and that's sort of how the specimen goes from something flat and sort of deceased into something else. Some other parts of my studio I have, of course, are my freezers and specimen storage. So this is a chest freezer. It's just devoted to taxidermy. And all my specimens, to save space, I actually, since I work with birds, I actually wrap them in pantyhose, and that compresses the feathers and kind of keeps them smooth and protected. And I'll wrap that in reusable plastic. And here are my tools and material storage. So the other tools we use in taxidermy are very much like things you can find at a hardware store. So things like screws, wire, foam, hammer, nails, like all of that hardware store stuff. That's here too. Lots of pliers, things like that, some saws. And this is my clean room. So this is the room I'm actually talking to you from now. So this is the room I actually do all the finishing work in. And on this particular day, it was being really well lit, so I chose that photo. But in here is sort of where I have really good light and have all of my paint and stuff like that, so I can see what I'm doing. And so what I'm going to sort of go through now is why keep taxidermy around. So why taxidermy? So one really big thing that I love about it is curiosity. So of course we've advanced a ton since the 1800s, and that's a really, really good thing that we have. But taxidermy has kind of gone in and out of taste and favor, but now more than ever, there's clearly a resurgence in interest as people kind of seek experiences. I mean, now all of our experiences are digital, but normally we're seeking these experiences that are not digital, where we can get close to something and kind of even feel something visceral. And the practice of taxidermy really puts you up close and personal, not only with the wonders of anatomy, but really, I mean, it's such a great way to kind of get close to science and have this practical scientific knowledge as you explore the inner workings of an animal. And I mean, whenever I skin something, I just look at it, no matter how large or small it is, and I just think about how this creature contains everything needed for life in this little package. It's absolutely incredible. And another thing too with curiosity is that, taxidermy is art made from a deceased animal, which some people think is really morbid. But honestly, I think it's a way that we can sort of stimulate conversations about our own mortality, and it kind of places a value on life and kind of has us question what our values of life are, and what we'd like to leave behind. And I think that's a really good thing for the future of conservation, is if we, kind of question how valuable life is, realize how valuable life is, and go on and work towards creating better futures. Another great thing about taxidermy, which the Harris Center knows a ton about, is public engagement. In a museum setting or in a nature setting, the public engages with stories and dioramas to tell, to appreciate not only the skill and artistry of a taxidermy mount. You can kind of get, like, if you really look at it long enough, you look at a particular artist long enough, you can kind of see the quirks of different makers of taxidermy. And it kind of like gives you a glimpse into the history and the conditions these pieces were made in, and even like the attitudes of the time. And a photo or video, as great as photos and videos can get, like, it doesn't really fully capture the weight and presence of an animal. And I think those experiences really start conversations that are really valuable conversations. And personally, those dioramas hit a soft spot for me because, as I said before, I grew up in a very urban environment. And so my access to nature was, if we went to the park once in a while. And I surely, didn't have the means to travel all over the world to see zebras and lions and stuff like that. But I could see them at a museum, and that was so, that was just, it changed my life seeing all of that stuff. And I think seeing the animals and seeing animals in these dioramas, I think it gives them a heft and a gravity, and it helps people understand things like what, it really gives a new meaning to words like habitat loss or wildlife trafficking, because you can look into these animals' eyes, even if the eyes aren't really looking back at you because they're made of glass. There's still such a great value to that. And you never know which future conservationist is going to be inspired as they walk through, those halls. The other value of it is artistic value, which a lot of people think taxidermy is home decor. Oh, it's just frivolous. But I beg to differ, because firstly, it's a small, you're usually supporting a small business. There's no real Amazon of taxidermy. Most taxidermists are very small businesses. They're making a sustainably made product. And, art made about animals, it has the power to bring awareness to their delicate situations. And some of my most exciting conversations have actually been had this way. So both of these pieces are actually replica pieces. These are replica flamingos on one side and replica bats on the other side. And these quality replicas made for home decor, they can sort of satisfy that aesthetic look, but it can also, you're also telling this person that, the reason these animals are replicas is because their status in the wild is threatened. And so we can't have the real thing, but by having a replica of it, you can sort of appreciate it and kind of have it at the top of your mind, have its wild condition at the top of your mind. Yes. And I think also seeing taxidermy in unexpected places can also help people who may not feel comfortable coming to a museum, or who just doesn't have access to a museum. It brings animals to people wherever they are. Another great value of taxidermy, which is kind of sad to think about, is extinction. Here on one side, we have a passenger pigeon. On the other side, we have my friend and mentor, George Dante, working on Lonesome George, who was the last Pinta Island tortoise on the Galapagos. And it would be far more preferable if animals did not go extinct, but taxidermy does preserve their forms for a study, for proof that they existed, and appreciation. And as haunting as it might be, they're artifacts that kind of serve as a testament to how easily the vibrance of biodiversity could just vanish. I remember all the emotions. Like, I was able to, the first time I handled a passenger pigeon, and, recently a friend brought one over for this photo I wanted to take. But handling these animals, they connect you to this place and time where, none of us here were alive, but this animal once darkened the skies, and it no longer is there. So they're really powerful reminders, and a great way to connect with things across time. And lastly, one of the great values I think of taxidermy is its cultural value. All of these mounts and dioramas, they carry a lot of the attitudes and stories of the people who made them. And as things change, or as new things are discovered, or as things wait to be discovered, these animals are also artifacts that are always changing in their value. So they carry these histories, they carry good histories, they carry bad histories, but taxidermy is a way of telling stories. And I think that my generation of taxidermists is not just telling our stories, but we're sort of creating new spaces to tell more stories, to tell more inclusive and more diverse stories, so that those become part of the narrative, and to address history in a more meaningful way. And I think that that's going to help this art form not fade into irrelevance and sort of evolve over time. And as we know, through nature, it just told us that, and as all science-loving people know, evolving is a really great thing. It's a good thing to do. And I think evolving is going to be great for conservation. So I hope that you've enjoyed seeing all of this taxidermy and stuff here. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you to Susie again, and thank you to Miles. I'm happy to answer any questions that you all might have.
Yeah. You're getting a lot of the comments are just how much people appreciated your presentation. That was really phenomenal. I loved, especially as did many people, the highlighting of taxidermists from the past. It was really great to hear the untold stories of the less spoken about taxidermists. So thank you for that. Yeah, and there are a bunch of questions. Great. A question from Laura is, she had heard that you can't really do taxidermy on immature birds because they lose their feathers. And she was wondering if that was true. And if it is true, are there any solutions to that?
So yeah, yes and no. So most of the birds I work with are not in like beautiful condition. I've worked on a few immature birds. So if there are birds that have like pin feathers or blood feathers, feathers that are just growing in, those are going to fall out when you're doing taxidermy. They're either gonna fall out or they're filled with, or if they're truly like blood feathers and they're filled with blood, you'll need to take them out and clean the blood out of them, and then you can put them back on. If a bird doesn't have a ton of feathers on it, like there are juvenile pigeons or certain chicks, or there's even a chicken that has a naked neck, or a lot of, I'm trying to think, even like toucan I had that had like it doesn't have feathers around its eye. With those birds, you have to rebuild the skin texture. So you can do that with wax. And then to get the fuzz or to get the feathers back on it, you can implant the feathers back in individually. Or you can use flocking, or you can, kind of use another material to give that illusion of the sort of immature feathers being there. So it's not impossible. It's just extra work.
Extra work. That was great. So a question that Ruth had is she wondered if the finished product or the finished specimen is the same weight as the original one.
It's not. It's usually a lot lighter. Actually, it's almost always a lot lighter because the original, you have all the meat and all the guts and all that stuff in there, whereas the replica, whereas taxidermy, you have either wood wool, balsa, like a balsa form or foam or something else that's lightweight and strong. A lot of older taxidermy, though, where they actually, would use the bones and stuff inside, or some of it uses plaster and burlap and stuff inside. Those can be kind of heavy, but they're still not as heavy, or at least I haven't seen one that's like as heavy as the original animal.
Wow, yeah, that would be hard if it was. It'd be hard to transport. As somebody who moved a lot of mounts in my life, if the beaver really weighed as much as a beaver, I'd be a lot stronger. Okay, people want to know, like, what's the most intriguing specimen you've worked on? And then another question that's related is, what animal are you itching to get your taxidermy tools on that you haven't?
I think so. I mean, I'm so lucky. I've worked on some really cool animals. I think that probably the most intriguing ones I've worked on are like anatomic anomalies, like, two-headed cows, or I worked on a chick that had 3 legs. It just had a third leg, it just had a third leg. Things like that. I'm working right now on a stillborn lamb that was born with 8 legs, 2 heads, and sort of 2 fused bodies. So those animals are super interesting because they completely throw like any of the art school education, any of your anatomy drawing education. It's completely out the window because symmetry isn't there. Like the normal rules of biology aren't there. It's sort of it's something really completely unique, and sort of like you're writing the rule book as you go along. So I think those are the most intriguing and probably, the most challenging and time consuming. As far as what I'd like to get my tools on, like I'm a bird lover. So any bird I haven't worked on before would be it. I would love to, like, if it would be anything, like I would love if like a museum or like a nature center, someone was like, we need you to work on a bird of paradise. That would be freaking awesome. A shoebill stork like Carl Cotton was working on, that would be amazing too. Those are giant birds, but they are truly like dinosaurs, and they just have just such incredible faces. And yeah, I think those would be my 2. If you asked me the same question tomorrow, it'd be something else completely different. So
very cool. So here's a couple of questions that are related about the bird's feet. And one person was wondering, when you showed the crane that you were working on, did you use the real crane legs, or did you use sort of replica feet?
Those were the real legs. So yeah, on the crane, I used on that one, I used the real legs. Normally on something like that, I try to use the real legs because they look nice, but there are some clients, I'm actually working on another crane where I'm molding the legs because that client worked with the zoo and they want the skeleton back for articulation. So you can do either.
Cool. And this is actually from Jenna, who's one of our naturalists here. And I get this question too. She says, when I'm teaching with bird mounts, the kids often ask if the beak and legs are real. And what it sounded like from maybe what you said, a lot of times they're not. They're kind of replica or made to look real. And is that generally true for something as delicate as a small beak or small feet?
It honestly depends. So the birds, a lot of the birds I showed replicas of the head because I prefer that because a lot of the clients I have, they want to keep the skull. But if I'm mounting something that doesn't have like, no, I don't want to say it doesn't have a remarkable skull because I think all their skulls are remarkable because they contain their brains and the workings of, their workings of their eyes and all of that. But if I'm working on something, I guess a more common species, like if I'm working on a starling or a sparrow or like a parakeet or something like that, I'll use the real skull. So it honestly depends. I think a lot of older taxidermy, they use the real skull and the replica heads are are a slightly more modern thing. So it really depends. Sometimes it's a real thing and sometimes it's not.
Yeah. I think I've noticed that with some of the ones I've handled. So Deborah is curious, and hopefully nobody's eating, but she wants to know how difficult it is to remove the skeleton. Do you remove it kind of bone by bone, or do you have to kind of take it out in one piece? How do you separate it?
Yeah, so for taxidermy, we're just taking the carcass out. So it all comes out in one piece, and I can kind of go back to the hummingbird. Let's see. Oh, wait. Let's go back to here. So here's the hummingbird, and let me see, is the screen share still showing?
No, it's off right now. You'll have to reshare.
All right, so here's hummingbird. So it comes out in one, so on a bird, I take it out in one piece like this here. So it's just that. And to get the bones from it, what I would do is pick this meat off bit by bit, and then you can macerate it, which is just soaking it in warm water and letting the tissue kind of just get eaten by bacteria and rot bit by bit and pick it off. Some people use beetles to clean a carcass to get the skeleton, like a colony of domestic beetles. Some people also just do the very old-fashioned way, which is burying it, so that bugs outside eat the bones. If you're going to bury bones, I would say probably don't do it on something really, really small. Like if you have a little sparrow skeleton, I would macerate that or have beetles eat it. If you're burying something, it would be something larger that you can go back to or put it in like a wire mesh cage or something like that. So yeah, and usually once the tissue is eaten away, like once the carcass and stuff is eaten away, and in whichever method that you use to clean bones, usually they are just a pile of loose bones unless you're monitoring it really closely and you keep some tendons and ligaments attached so that you can keep track of what bone is connected to what. And that's the method I use for I do a lot of sparrow and starling skeletons for educational use for myself and as a cool thing to sell at various oddity markets and stuff. And those are done with that ligament preparation.
Very cool. So here's a couple of questions that are kind of related, and they're all have to do with where do you get your specimens that you're working on, and kind of what are the rules around that, and is there a concern that that it might kind of prove an opportunity for unscrupulous kind of traders?
Absolutely. So one thing so specimens I get, since I work on mostly birds, most of them are domestic birds. For anything that I do that's not for a museum or not for a nature center or a specimen not provided by a client like that, those are from either an aviary or private breeder, zoos, and things like that. I also get chickens from farms and pheasants from farms and ducks, because those are all things that I eat. So I buy them whole. There is a lot of opportunity for unscrupulous behavior or just straight up illegal behavior. But that's really frowned upon in the taxidermy world, because no one likes, I know everyone has different feelings about hunting and things like that, but people, whether you're a hunter, whether you're a non-hunter, nobody wants to engage in illegal wildlife trafficking or anything like that. So people like that, or people who engage in that, or people who engage in sort of like illegal trade or trade in like endangered species that's not done above board, like that's not done for like a museum or something like that, those people are really not like, they're really not welcome in the industry, and they're kind of given, they're kind of not engaged with, I would say that. I mean, does it still happen? I'm sure it does out there somewhere, but it's not anything that I would do. And as far as like knowing the laws and stuff, the laws do vary state to state. Like the law that I'm most concerned with, it's a federal law, which is the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which protects all native US birds. The only birds that are flying around outside that you can pick up without any consequence are the European starling, the English sparrow, and the rock dove or feral pigeon, which is the pigeon that flies around. So every other bird is protected. There are provisions for game birds, like birds that are hunted, but pretty much like, if you see a hummingbird, if you see a cardinal, if you see a blue jay, if it flies into your window, if you had a dream that it told you to mount it after it flew into your window, like there's no legal way to have that unless you are a nature center or a museum or another institution that's accredited to have that. So a lot of the laws can be found online. They do vary state to state, so you should go to your state's Department of Natural Resources or Department of Environmental Conservation, and the Federal Fish and Wildlife website. They have a lot of the laws. I also have links on my website under the learning section to a few different websites that have compiled the laws from state to state. So that's a good resource too to know about the laws. But yeah, a lot of the places where you can, there's even like websites like taxidermy.net where people sell specimens. But the moderators on there are very, very much frowned upon. They very much frown upon like unsavory behavior. When it comes to like hunting and stuff, that's a more personal decision. Some people are okay with hunting, some people don't feel good about it. That's a far more personal decision. To me, like the hunters I know, they're using everything. They're using everything from head to foot or nose to tail. So I'm a person that eats meat. I don't have a problem with it if it's done in a sustainable way. But everyone is different, and I think there should be room for for everyone's different perspectives on that.
Wow, great. Well said, Divya. Like all that was great information. So there was some funny questions about your workspace. People were hoping that you chopped your onions in a different spot.
I did, yeah. Yeah, my workspace looks like a kitchen, but it's not a kitchen. Yeah. So I live in a house, so that's the first workspace I showed you, which has like my specimen prep area, the sort of like the skinning, I call it the skinning and preparation area, like the spa, SPA, the spa. But yeah, I don't eat there. That's not what it's not, yeah.
Well, on kind of on the heels of that question, there's a question about, Leslie's wondering about, is there an odor when you're working with dead animals, and how do you kind of manage that?
That's a really good question. So the odor varies. So if I have something like a chicken, right? It just smells like chicken from a store. But if I'm working on roadkill, like if I have like a roadkill fox or something, that usually smells a lot funkier. So the odor varies from animal to animal, but it's not just the animal that has the variation. There's also the amount of fat that's underneath the skin, because fat goes rancid. Like I can say like lots of, like that crane I worked on, it just stunk. And I don't know why, it just smelled so bad, but it has a lot of that tissue under the skin, or it has a lot of that viscera and stuff under the skin that it just was rancid. So it can vary by the condition of the animal, how long, like especially with roadkill, if it's been out for a while, what the contents of its gut, its digestive tract. With mammals, you've got like anal glands and scent glands and all of that stuff. So the odor varies. As far as how to manage it, like I'm really lucky. That's why I have my specimen prep area in a completely different part of my house than my living area, and even this room that I'm in now, this finishing room. So separation, but also like ventilating the area and just cleaning things as soon as possible. There's also just like taking the trash out. Like if I have something that's odorous, like an odorous carcass, I'll put it in, I'll put it into a trash bag, freeze it, and I only throw it out when it's frozen. So that's like, I want to be nice to the people taking out the garbage. But most of the carcasses I actually give to a friend that cleans them for bones. But even still, I freeze everything as soon as I can. So it's really just getting the stuff out of there. But yeah, there is an odor to taxidermy when it's raw. When it's finished, there should be no odor. In fact, it should smell good when it's finished.
Well said. So if it smells bad, something's wrong.
Yeah, something is wrong.
Yeah. So people are curious about how long does it take you to finish a project? It's not like an overnight thing. It's long term.
It can be a long time. And honestly, it depends. So like that hummingbird took, I think, a week to do from start to finish. And that's because a lot of that was like, of course, the skinning was done fairly quickly. The skinning and fleshing was done in a day, but then I was making the form. But the sort of nitpicky part was after mounting it, was grooming it and getting every feather in place. Like I'll use a little set of tweezers like this. I can hold up to the screen. They're like really fine tweezers, and I just tweeze each feather into place so that they're aligned and symmetrical. And then of course, like painting that little beak to look right. So it can take anywhere from a week, but I've also had some, because I'm not only working on one thing at a time, I've also had projects take as long as a year, especially if I work on someone's, like sometimes I do pets, like a very limited number of pet clients a year. Those are probably the longest commissions I take, because that can't just look like a cat. It has to look like that particular cat. It has to look like that individual. Whereas a bird for a museum, like a sparrow for a museum, can look like the sparrow that it is. It's an anonymous sparrow. It's not an individual. So.
Wow, that's fascinating. That's really interesting. And you mentioned paints and kind of pigments and making things look real. And Jane is wondering, what kind of paints and pigments do you actually use for the beak and the eyes? That's a special kind of paints?
Yeah, what I use the most, so because I work in a smaller space, I don't really use a lot of lacquer-based paints. I have them all around me, so I'm like reaching and grabbing them if you see me duck and move. So I use Golden's acrylics a lot, which are just, these blend really easily. They're also just a fun paint to use, and I like the container, and they have good blending and good staying power. And the other thing I use a lot are pan pastels, which I'll pull out a tray of. And these are really fun. And I'll hold up I'll pull one out to hold up the label if someone wants to get the label. But these are really fun because you can buy them individually. I do this a lot, so I have the whole fun tray. It's as exciting as getting a makeup palette, I think. It's like, this is so fun. But they work a lot like makeup. They're a powder, and you can blend them using a sponge or a soft brush, or even like an eyeshadow blender. And those are the two main paints and pigments I use. There's pigments and stuff to color waxes and to color silicones and things like that. But I think if you're just starting out, I would say get like the basic set of, get like a primary color set of golden acrylics with like black and brown and ochre and stuff like that. And to get they sell smaller sets of pan pastels. You can get a smaller set or get the individual colors that you like. Or if you don't want to make the investment in the pan pastels, you can even use like inexpensive makeup that you're not going to put on your face, and just try it with that first before you're investing in that.
That's so cool. So I guess there's a question about, do you ever do taxidermy on insects, or is that different? That's sort of like drying and pinning.
Yeah, with insects, it's drying and pinning. There are like certain fleshy specimens, like a tarantula or something, where you want to empty the abdomen and fill that with something else, so it doesn't like have that shrunken and shriveled look. But yeah, I do preserve insects.
That's cool. Here's a pretty please question, because it was earlier and then I lost it. But best formalin alternative, pretty please.
It really depends on what you're doing. I mean, like the only time I will use formalin is for wet specimens, but I don't really do wet specimens myself. So the reason for some people use formalin inside of bird feet, but for me inside of bird feet, I like to remove the tendons and take them out. So there's not much that can rot in there aside from, there's like cartilage and stuff in there. But I use Master's Blend in bird's feet, which is just like an expanding resin. I've also, depending on the kind of bird, I've also just skinned out a bird's foot. And if it's really fleshy, I've skinned it out, removed the fat, and just built it up with epoxy inside of there. And of course, with the, building that epoxy around the wire. So there's that. But if you're doing a wet specimen, I think that you have to actually use formalin for a wet specimen. But as far as like taxidermy goes, like injecting formalin in parts, I just remove the tissue instead.
That was really interesting too. And this is a question from Brett Thielen, who works with us. And I know that everybody who works at the Harris Center wants to know the answer to this. So I have to ask it. How long can a specimen stay frozen and still be useful for taxidermy? Since we have our freezer of death, we always wonder when is it time to move the specimen to maybe like a bone box?
So if the freezer is running, it depends on the frost in your freezer. Like if your freezer like needs to be defrosted, you should defrost it and, check on the specimens. I've worked on specimens that are older than me. So I worked on specimens that have been frozen for 30 plus years, So and those came about, they've been like pheasants and like larger birds. And with those, like the feet were freezer burned, but you're able to inject it with certain things to relieve the freezer burn. So it was really based on the freezer burn of the specimens. I would say if you have something like, if you need to make like a priority list of the things to work on, I would say get your smaller things out because those will freezer burn and become mummified almost or freeze dried almost faster than something larger. So it's unique to each specimen and to your freezer. So if things are the smaller things, anything like this size and, anything like this size, anything that can fit like in this sort of space here, you'd want to work on those things first. And then work on, the larger stuff can usually withstand getting freezer burn a bit longer. But you can also store your specimens in a way that kind of guards against freezer burn too.
That's great. That was so helpful. And it made everybody at the Harris Center staff and other people who might have their freezer of death, as we like to call it, feel a lot more relief. So thank you. And wow, you answered so many questions and you gave such a golden presentation. That was just phenomenal. People are going crazy.
Oh, good.
It was really top notch. And you just won over a whole bunch of fans.
Thank you.
Really appreciate you.
And along those lines, if people want to keep in touch and follow your work, how can they best do that?
My website is gothamtaxidermy.com. So I don't update my website as often as I do, but I do update Instagram pretty often. So my Instagram is the same, Gotham Taxidermy. So that's a great place to keep in touch. And if anyone is interested in like learning taxidermy or wants like links to more resources or anything like that, you're more than welcome to shoot me an email.
You are so awesome.
Thank you. You're awesome.
We really appreciate it. And we appreciate everybody who showed up tonight to hear this amazing presentation. And Divya, if you were at the Harris Center, you would get a standing ovation. So, thank you. That was fabulous. And
thanks to everyone who showed up too.
That's great. Have a great weekend, everybody. And keep your eyes open on Gotham Taxidermy. I love to follow the Instagram posts. They're amazing.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.